The air in the Great Mosque of Córdoba is thick with incense and expectation. Abd Al-rahman, III, now 23, stands before the assembled ranks of his court. The weight of the black Abbasid turban is gone, replaced by the simple, profound authority of his presence. For 8 long years, he has fought. Not just against rebels in the mountains or rival taifa kings, but against a deeper shadow, the ghost of a fractured legacy. Today, he ends that war. The murmur of the crowd hushes. His voice, clear and steady, cuts through the silence, echoing off the forest of marble and jasper columns. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, we declare ourselves the commander of the faithful, the defender of the religion of God. We are Al-Nasir, lead-in, Allah the defender of the religion of God. A single title, spoken into the stillness. Caliph. The word hangs in the air, then detonates. A roar of acclamation shakes the very foundations. Allahu Akbar. It is the 16th of January, in the year 929 of the Christian calendar. The Umayyad Caliphate of Al-Andalus is born. But in Abd al-Rahman's mind, there is no triumphant fanfare. Only a crushing, solemn relief. He can finally hear the silence. The endless, gnawing whisper of doubt from the north, from Baghdad, from the Fatimids in Ifriqiya, that said Córdoba was merely an emirate, a provincial outpost, is gone. Smothered by his own will. He walks from the mosque into the blinding Andalusian sun. The heat is a physical blanket, heavy on his embroidered robes. The scent of orange blossoms from the palace gardens is suddenly overwhelming, a sweetness after years of tasting nothing but dust and iron. The cheers of the people lining the streets are a wave of sound, but his internal monologue is a quiet counterpoint. This is not a crown they cheer for. It is an idea. Unity. A single sun, where before there were 100 squabbling stars. The camera sweeps from his solitary figure to the sprawling city below the Guadalquivir River, a silver ribbon, the rooftops a sea of terracotta, the distant Sierra a purple haze. This is his canvas. And his first act as caliph is not to rest, but to build. We see the breaking of ground at a site just outside Córdoba. The sound is not of swords, but of 1,000 picks striking hard earth, a rhythmic, hopeful percussion. Madinat al-Zahra. The radiant city. He stands on a rise, watching, the wind tugging at his cloak. This is his dream made stone, a palace city that will be the administrative heart and the undeniable symbol of the new caliphate. He speaks to his chief architect, his voice low, almost intimate against the din of construction. Let its gates be so wide that 40 horsemen may ride abreast through them. Let its halls tell a story in marble and gold. The story of Al-Andalus, whole and unbroken. But a throne, even an unrivaled one, is not defended by marble alone. We ride with him north, to the frontier. The heat here is different, drier, harsher, smelling of time and desperation. The Christian kingdoms of Leon and Navarre are testing the new caliph's resolve. We are in the saddle beside him. The sensory world is reduced to the creak of leather, the jingle of bit rings, the gritty feel of dust coating the throat. He surveys a line of marching men, a professional army paid from his own treasury, loyal to the state, not to a tribal chief. Their banners bear a single, new device, the caliphal standard. The clash, when it comes, is swift and brutal. At Valdejuncura, the Andalusian cavalry descends like a hammer. The soundscape is a chaos of screaming horses, the shing of blades being drawn, the dull thud of impact. Abd al-Rahman does not fight in the front line, but he is close enough to see it. To smell the fear and the blood mixing with the dust. His expression is not one of rage, but of grim calculus. This is the price of the silence, he thinks, watching a Leonese standard fall. This is the language they understand. Victory is decisive. The Christian advance crumbles. Envoys arrive at his campaign tent, their arrogance replaced by a wary respect. Treaties are signed, tribute promised. The frontier, for now, is quiet. He returns to Córdoba not as a returning hero, but as a working monarch. The night is cool. In his private study in the Alcazar, the only sound is the scratching of a reed pen on parchment and the distant call of the night watch. Maps are spread before him, not just of Iberia, but of the Mediterranean. He traces a finger along the coast of North Africa. The Fatimid shadow still looms there. His internal voice is calm, resolved. The throne is unrivaled in Al-Andalus. But a caliph's gaze must reach further. The sea. The sea is the next frontier. He looks up from the maps, out through a lattice window at the first hint of dawn staining the sky. The construction of Madinat al-Zahra continues, day and night. The sound of distant chisels is the heartbeat of his reign. The golden age has not arrived. He is laying its foundation, stone by stone, treaty by treaty, with the relentless patience of a man who has spent a lifetime waiting for his dawn. And now that it is here, he will not blink. He will build a light so radiant, the world will have no choice but to see. The throne of Córdoba, carved from the deep history of Al-Andalus, was not a seat of comfort for the young emir, Abd al-Rahman. It was a crucible. The year was 912, and the echoes of his grandfather's reign, a time of relative peace and unchallenged authority, had long since faded into the distant past. What Abd al-Rahman inherited was not a jewel, but a fractured mosaic, each piece vying for its own sovereignty, held together by the thinnest veneer of Umayyad legacy. The cheers that had greeted his ascension had barely died when the true weight of his inheritance pressed down upon him. From the sun-baked plains of the Algarve to the jagged sierras that sliced through the heart of the peninsula, the land seethed with defiance. Powerful warlords, emboldened by decades of central weakness, ruled their domains like kings, their loyalty to Córdoba a mere formality, if even that. They were wolves in the night, gnawing at the very foundations of the emirate. Abd al-Rahman knew that before he could even dream of building, he first had to reclaim. His mind, sharp and agile beyond his years, wrestled with the enormity of the task. He walked the polished marble floors of his palace in the quiet hours before dawn, the cool stone a stark contrast to the burning ambition in his chest. The silence of the vast halls was often broken only by the rustle of his own robes or the distant call of a muezzin. But even in the stillness, he heard the whispers, the insidious murmurings of discontent, the subtle shift in loyalties, the glint of ambition in the eyes of men who had served his ancestors. The serpent's coil was not just external. It lay coiled within the very heart of his court. His advisers, men of age and experience, offered counsel born of caution. Patience, Emir, they would urge. The land is vast, the rebels entrenched. Strike too soon, and you risk all. But Abd al-Rahman saw their caution as stagnation, a path that had led his predecessors to the brink of ruin. He was not merely an emir, he was the last hope of a dynasty. He could not afford patience. He could only afford victory. The most formidable of his adversaries was Umar ibn Hafsun, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect across Al-Andalus. From his impregnable mountain fortress of Bobastro, Ibn Hafsun commanded a diverse army of Christian converts, Berbers, and disillusioned Arabs, a testament to the chaotic currents that coursed through the land. He was a phantom, a hydra, cutting him down in one place only for him to rise again elsewhere. The very image of Ibn Hafsun, a bearded giant in rough-spun wool, contrasted sharply with Abd al-Rahman's own youthful, aristocratic bearing. Yet the young emir recognized a shared fire, an unyielding will. Abd al-Rahman knew his first moves had to be decisive, not just on the battlefield, but in the intricate dance of the court. He saw the way certain officials lingered, their eyes too keen, their smiles too wide. He felt the tension in the air, a subtle current of fear and opportunism. He began to consolidate power, not with brute force, but with a calculated, almost surgical precision. Old loyalties were tested, new alliances forged. Those who wavered found themselves subtly sidelined. Those who betrayed, swiftly, silently removed. The marble halls, once echoing with the casual chatter of courtiers, began to hum with a new kind of energy, one of purpose and of palpable, underlying tension. Every glance was measured, every word weighed. His first campaigns were not against the might of Bobastro, but against smaller, more vulnerable rebel strongholds closer to Córdoba. These were not grand sieges, but swift, punishing expeditions designed to send a clear message. He rode at the head of his cavalry, the desert sun baking his face, the dust of the road clinging to his robes. He heard the clang of steel, the shouts of men, the desperate pleas of the vanquished. He saw the fear in the eyes of his enemies, and the growing admiration in the eyes of his own soldiers. He felt the thrum of power, raw and undeniable, as he rode through newly subjugated towns, their gates now open to him, their banners lowered. Each small victory was a brick laid in the foundation of his ambition, but each also revealed the true depth of the rot. The land was exhausted, its people weary of constant strife. He understood then that his fight was not just against rebellious lords, but against the despair that had settled over Al-Andalus. He needed to offer more than just conquest. He needed to offer hope, stability, and the promise of a glorious future. Back in Córdoba, the nights were long. Abd al-Rahman would pore over maps, tracing lines with his finger, envisioning the intricate web of roads, rivers, and fortresses. He saw not just a collection of rebellious territories, but a single, unified empire, a beacon of civilization. He knew the path would be long, fraught with danger, and stained with blood. He would have to be ruthless, but also just. He would have to inspire, but also command. The whispers in the marble halls still lingered, but they were slowly giving way to the growing murmur of his own authority, a formidable presence solidifying with each passing day. The serpent's coil was untangling, but the head of the beast, Bobastro, still loomed, casting a long, dark shadow over his dreams. His true test, he knew, was yet to come. The sun over Al-Andalus is not a friend. It is a relentless observer. It hangs in a sky bleached of all color, a white-hot eye watching the boy who would be king as he rides into the furnace of his own inheritance. Abd al-Rahman sits atop his stallion, the leather of the saddle creaking a rhythmic, lonely sound that underscores the silence of the wasteland. He is 21 years old. Behind him lies the marble cool of Córdoba, the perfumed gardens of the Alcazar, and the ghost of his grandfather, Abdallah, whose final breath was a command: unite what is broken, or be buried by the shards. Before him, the horizon shimmers with the heat of 1,000 rebellions. This is the land of the fitna, a landscape fractured by blood feuds and the ambitions of men who believe the Umayyad flame has finally flickered out. To the south, the mountains of the Serrania de Ronda rise like jagged teeth against the haze. Somewhere in those limestone fortresses, the rebel Umar ibn Hafsun waits, a thorn that has festered in the side of the dynasty for 30 years. Abd al-Rahman feels the grit of the desert on his teeth. Every breath is a mouthful of dust and history. He looks at his hands pale, the hands of a scholar who spent his youth immersed in scrolls and the quiet geometry of the stars. But now those fingers are stained by the oil of his sword's hilt. He realizes, with a coldness that defies the midday heat, that he is no longer a student of the past. He is the architect of a bloody future. The march is a symphony of iron and exhaustion. The narrator's voice would drop here, hushed, as the camera lingers on the faces of the soldier Syrians, Berbers, and Slavs, their skin cracked like the parched earth beneath their boots. They watch their young emir. They look for a sign of weakness, a stumble, a moment of doubt. But Abd al-Rahman does not waver. He has learned the first lesson of power in the sands. If you cannot be loved, you must be the horizon inevitable and unyielding. The Crimson Tide begins not with a grand battle, but with the slow, agonizing siege of Essaja. The air here is thick with the smell of wood smoke and rotting fruit. The city walls are a defiant grey against the orange dust. Abd al-Rahman watches from his pavilion as the catapults groan, their heavy arms swinging like the pendulums of fate. The sound of the stones striking the ramparts is a dull, rhythmic thud, the heartbeat of a dying resistance. Inside his mind, there is a different storm. He remembers the stories of his ancestors in Damascus, the glory of a caliphate that once spanned the world, lost in a single night of black banners and betrayal. He is the last of them. If he falls here, in this sun-drenched corner of the West, the name Umayyad becomes a footnote, a whisper in the wind. The blood of the vine is for the weak, he whispers to the shadows of his tent. The blood of the land is for the strong. When the walls finally breach, the tide breaks. It is not the clean, heroic clash of the poets. It is a chaotic, visceral roar. The sound of steel on steel is a high-pitched scream that vibrates in the marrow of his bones. He leads from the front, not because he is reckless, but because he knows that a crown held by a coward is nothing but a gilded target. The heat of the combat is different from the heat of the sun. It is wet. It is heavy. He feels the spray of the crimson tied on his cheek, a hot, metallic reminder of the cost of unity. He sees the eyes of the men he cuts down. They are not monsters, but neighbors, rebels who grew tired of taxes and distant lords. For a fleeting second, the scholar in him grieves. Then the emir takes over. He pushes the grief into a dark corner of his soul, a place he will visit only in the dead of night when the campfires have burned to ash. By the time the moon rises over the smoking ruins of the rebel strongholds, the landscape has changed. The red dust of the day has turned to a ghostly silver. Abd al-Rahman stands on the ramparts of a conquered fort, his cloak heavy with the grime of the campaign. He looks out over the endless sands, reaching toward the sea. He can smell the salt on the wind, a reminder of the Fatimids rising in the south, a new threat from the shores of Africa. He realizes that this is only the beginning. The pacification of Al-Andalus will not be won with a single charge or a solitary victory. It is a labor of decades. He must be the sun that dries the marshes and the flood that cleanses the streets. His internal monologue shifts from the fear of failure to the cold calculation of a sovereign. He understands now that the crown is not a gift, it is a burden of iron. The boy who left Córdoba is dead, buried somewhere in the trenches of the Ebro and the dust of the south. In his place stands a man who has tasted the crimson tide and found it necessary. As the episode draws to a close, the camera pulls back, showing the small flickering lights of his campfires dotting the vast, dark expanse of the Iberian Peninsula. They look like fallen stars. Abd al-Rahman turns away from the horizon and walks back into the light of his pavilion. The sand continues to shift, the wind erasing the footprints of the fallen, but the map of a new empire is already being drawn in the mind of the man who refused to break. The tide is rising, and for the first time in a century, the house of Umayyad is not drowning. It is learning how to command the waves. The sun beat down on the parched plains of Al-Andalus, a relentless golden hammer forging the very earth into dust. Yet, even as Abd al-Rahman III rode, his retinue a shimmering river of steel and silk across the land, the heat was a lesser adversary than the chill that often settled in his heart. He had, in his early years, performed miracles. He had wrestled back cities from recalcitrant warlords, quelled insurrections that had plagued his forebears for generations, and begun the arduous task of stitching a fractured realm back into a cohesive whole. Córdoba, his beloved capital, now pulsed with a nascent glory, a promise whispered on the wind. But the whispers often carried the hiss of serpents. For every victory celebrated in the grand halls of the Alcazar, for every defiant banner struck down, another shadow seemed to coalesce on the horizon. His early reign was a brutal education, a masterclass in the fickle nature of loyalty and the treacherous depths of human ambition. The most enduring thorn in his side, the very embodiment of this ceaseless rebellion, was Omar ibn Hafsun. From his mountain stronghold of Bobastro, Omar, a cunning and chameleon-like figure, had defied 3 emirs, playing a dangerous game of conversion and apostasy, now Christian, now Muslim, always a rebel. He was a symbol of the Muwalladun discontent, but more than that, he was a master of exploiting weakness, a weaver of discord. Abd al-Rahman had chased him across mountains, besieged his fortresses, and seen his forces scattered only to rise again. He knew the cost of this endless war, not just in coin and blood, but in the erosion of trust, the corroding doubt that peace could ever truly take root. Then came the messengers, riding hard from the south, their faces etched with the dust and urgency of their tidings. Omar ibn Hafsun, they reported, weary and cornered after yet another decisive defeat, was sending envoys. He sought terms. He offered submission. Again. Abd al-Rahman, seated on his throne, felt the familiar prickle of suspicion, a cold knot in his gut. The marble halls of his palace, usually a sanctuary of order, felt suddenly charged with an unspoken tension. He studied the faces of the envoys, their eyes downcast, their voices modulated with feigned humility. They spoke of Omar's weariness, his desire for peace, his regret for past transgressions. They offered assurances, oaths, even hostages. It was a performance, polished by years of desperate survival. But the weight of endless conflict, the yearning for a definitive end to the Bobastro menace, was a heavy cloak. Could this, finally, be it? Could the serpent truly be ready to shed its skin and lie down? He remembered the promises made before, the pledges of fealty, the brief, illusory calms that had preceded renewed storms. He saw the glint in his vizier's eyes, a flicker of hope, but also a silent plea for an end to the bloodshed. Abd al-Rahman, ever the pragmatist, yet still harboring a youthful idealism that yearned for a united, prosperous Al-Andalus, considered the cost of rejection. Another campaign, more lives, more resources diverted from the monumental task of building. He made his decision, a calculated risk, a gamble on a fragile peace. He would accept Omar's terms. He would extend his hand, offer a chance at true reconciliation. The news spread, a wave of cautious optimism through Córdoba. But the desert winds carried more than just hope. They carried the faint scent of deceit. Weeks turned into months. Omar, as if mocking Abd al-Rahman's earnest desire for unity, used the reprieve to rebuild his forces, to strengthen his defenses, to sow new seeds of rebellion among the disaffected. The submission was a feint, a masterstroke of treachery. The peace was a poisoned chalice. The betrayal, when it finally became undeniable, struck Abd al-Rahman with a visceral force, a blow not to his body, but to his very soul. It wasn't just the breaking of a truce. It was the shattering of a nascent hope, the confirmation of his deepest fears about the inherent perfidy of men. The internal monologue raged within him. How many times? How many more times will this land bleed, because men choose their petty power over the harmony of the whole? How can I build a golden age when the very foundations are constantly undermined by such bitter malice? He stood by the window of his private chamber, the cool night air a balm on his heated skin, but it could not soothe the fire in his spirit. The distant murmur of Córdoba, the city he was destined to make the jewel of the world, felt like a judgment. He had offered mercy, and it had been met with manipulation. He had extended a hand, and it had been met with a serpent's bite. The betrayer's kiss was not a literal embrace, but the insidious, false promise of peace that had been nothing more than a tactical maneuver, a calculated deception designed to buy time for renewed hostility. It was a stain, not just on the memory of the truce, but on the very fabric of his burgeoning legacy, a constant reminder that even the grandest visions could be compromised by the basest human flaws. This experience, more than any open battle, hardened Abd al-Rahman. It stripped away the last vestiges of youthful naivety, replacing them with a steely resolve. He learned that true authority was not merely about military might, but about an unyielding will and absolute intolerance for defiance. The golden age he envisioned would not be born of gentle persuasion, but forged in the crucible of absolute power. The betrayer's kiss had taught him a brutal lesson. To secure his dream, he would have to become as unyielding as the mountains, as relentless as the sun. The time for clemency, for gambles on human decency, was over. From this moment on, his reign would be marked by an unwavering resolve, where loyalty was demanded and betrayal met with swift, uncompromising justice. The struggle against Omar ibn Hafsun would continue, but Abd al-Rahman III would meet it with a new, formidable intensity, forever marked by the bitter taste of deceit. The summer of 939 burns across the Iberian plateau like an open wound. Abd al-Rahman III sits motionless on his Arabian stallion, watching dust devils dance across the Castilian plain. For nearly 30 years, he has known nothing but victory. He has bent rebellious cities to his will, crushed Fatimid fleets in the Mediterranean, transformed Córdoba into a jewel that makes Baghdad weep with envy. Kings and emperors address him as Caliph, commander of the faithful, shadow of God on earth. But today, the shadow feels different. Heavier, almost prophetic. His army stretches behind him like a living tapestry, 50,000 warriors, perhaps more. Berber cavalry from the Atlas Mountains. Syrian archers who can pierce a man's eye at 200 paces. The elite Slavic guard, their blonde hair strange and beautiful beneath Andalusian sun. They have marched north for weeks, crossing rivers that run dry, through villages that empty at their approach. The Christian kingdoms have dared to break their treaties, dared to raid Muslim territories. Ramiro II of Leon has forgotten who rules this land. Abd al-Rahman means to remind him. The fortress of Simancas rises ahead, its walls the color of old bone. Intelligence reports said it would fall quickly. A minor stronghold. A symbolic victory before pushing deeper into Christian territory. The Caliph's generals had smiled when they saw it little more than a garrison, they said. We'll take it by evening prayer. But as the Cordoban army approaches, something feels wrong. The fortress sits too quiet. No panicked defenders rushing to positions. No frantic ringing of church bells. Just silence, thick and waiting. Abd al-Rahman raises his hand. The army halts. 50,000 men stop breathing at once. My lord, his vizier whispers, the men are ready. Let us take what is ours. The Caliph studies the landscape. His father taught him to read terrain the way scholars read ancient texts. Every hill has a story. Every valley hides a verb. And this valley, this approaches to Simancas, speaks in a language he suddenly understands too late. The attack begins at noon, when the sun turns the sky into hammered bronze. Cordoban infantry advances in perfect formation, their shields locked, their battle chants rolling across the plain like thunder. The archers follow, arrows already nocked. The Berber cavalry circles wide, preparing to cut off any retreat. It's textbook. It's flawless. It's exactly what Ramiro wants. The first charge reaches the fortress walls. Ladders rise. Men climb. And then, from the hills on either side, the Christian army emerges like a breaking wave. Not hundreds. Thousands. Heavy cavalry in chain mail, their lances lowered, their war cries splitting the afternoon air. They've been waiting. Hidden in the folds of the landscape, patient as stones. Abd al-Rahman feels his stomach drop. It's an ambush. A perfectly executed trap. The Christian knights crash into the Cordoban flanks with the force of a collapsing mountain. The sound god, the sound metal on metal, bone on bone, men screaming in languages that bleed together into one long howl of agony. The Berber cavalry tries to wheel around, but they're caught between the fortress and the charging Christians, pressed together so tightly that swords become useless. Men fall from their horses and are trampled by their own brothers. The Caliph's Slavic guard closes around him, their bodies a living wall. "We must retreat," the captain shouts, his face splattered with someone else's blood. "My lord, we must," but Abd al-Rahman cannot move. He watches his perfect army come apart like cloth in fire. A Syrian commander he's known for 20 years takes a lance through the throat. A young Berber warrior, barely 17, screams for his mother as Christian swords find him. The battle standards of Córdoba, those magnificent banners that have flown over 100 victories, fall into the mud, trampled beneath Christian boots. For the first time in his life, Abd al-Rahman III tastes defeat. It's bitter as copper. Bitter as betrayal. The retreat is chaos. What was an army becomes a mob. Men throw down their weapons to run faster. Cavalry abandons infantry. The Christians pursue like wolves that have tasted blood, cutting down the slowest, the weakest, the ones who stumble. The fields around Simancas turn red. The Tormes River runs crimson for 3 days. Night falls. Abd al-Rahman sits in his tent 20 miles from the battlefield, surrounded by what remains of his guard. Reports come in like hammer blows. 10,000 dead. 15,000. The numbers stop meaning anything. His chief general is dead. His nephew is dead. His favorite poet, who rode with the army to compose verses of victory, is dead. The Caliph of Córdoba, master of Al-Andalus, the man who never loses, stares at his hands. They're shaking. For 30 years, he has built an empire on the foundation of his own invincibility. And in a single afternoon, on a dusty plain beneath a merciless sun, that foundation has cracked. Outside, his soldiers weep. Inside, Abd al-Rahman sits alone with his failure, learning what every great man must eventually learn, that even eagles fall. The sun, a relentless hammer, beat down upon the parched earth of Al-Andalus. For years, the young Abd al-Rahman had ridden under its unforgiving gaze, his sword a beacon, his vision clear, to unite this fractured land. He had reclaimed cities, broken alliances, and instilled a sense of purpose in his army. Yet the cancer of rebellion, deep-rooted and tenacious, clung to the mountains like a venomous vine, none more stubborn than the fortress that now defied him. He stood atop a dusty ridge, the wind whipping his cloak around him, carrying the faint, metallic scent of blood and desperation. Below, the siege lines stretched for miles, a vast, coiled serpent around the rebel stronghold. It had been weeks, then months, of relentless assault. His siege engines, once symbols of his might, now stood scarred and splintered, their great timbers groaning under the strain of repeated failures. Each morning the trumpets called, each evening the reports brought only more casualties, more defiance from within those unyielding walls. He had promised his men victory. He had sworn to Al-Andalus that he would purge these shadows. But now, as the sun dipped, painting the sky in hues of defeat, a cold dread began to seep into his bones. His eyes, usually alight with fierce determination, clouded with a weariness that went beyond the physical. He could hear the low murmurs among his veteran commanders, the subtle shifts in their posture, the unspoken question in their gazes. How much longer, my lord? How many more lives for a rock? That night, alone in his tent, the flickering lamp cast long, dancing shadows, mirroring the turmoil within him. He traced the lines on a parchment map, the rebel stronghold a dark blotch, mocking his authority. He remembered the exhilarating rush of his early victories, the cheers of the populace, the palpable sense of hope he had ignited. Now a different sound echoed in his memory, the screams of his dying soldiers, the defiant taunts from the battlements, the rasp of his own voice, raw from shouting commands that went unheeded by fate. He slammed his fist onto the table, the tremor rattling a clay lamp. Was this the destiny of a caliph? To be forever chasing shadows in these unforgiving hills. The weight of his grandfather's legacy pressed down, a crown of thorns on his brow. His predecessors had faced their own trials, but none, it seemed, had encountered a resistance so utterly immune to the logic of force. He felt the bitterness rise, a corrosive bile in his throat. He had thrown everything he had, his finest strategists, his bravest warriors, his vast resources, and still the enemy endured. Sleep offered no solace. He saw faces in the darkness, the stern visage of his advisers, the hopeful eyes of his people waiting for news, and the ghostly forms of those who had fallen under his command. He had led them to this stalemate, this grinding, attritional nightmare. Doubt, a serpent he thought he had long since slain, began to coil around his heart. Had he overestimated his strength? Underestimated the depth of the chaos he had inherited? He rose before dawn, the air still cool but promising another scorching day. He walked out of his tent, past the sleeping forms of his guards, and stood gazing at the enemy's silhouette against the pale, bruised sky. It was then, in that moment of raw vulnerability, that a new understanding began to dawn. He had fought with fire, but this enemy was stone. He had relied on speed, but this battle demanded patience. He had believed in the might of his sword, but perhaps a different kind of weapon was needed. The defeat was not in the failure to take the fortress. He realized with a stark clarity that cut through the fog of his despair. The defeat was in the way he had fought. He had been rigid, predictable, driven by youthful impatience and a desperate need to prove himself. He had seen the enemy as a brute force to be crushed, not as a complex organism fed by fear and desperation, but also by local loyalties and the sheer will to survive. A tremor ran through him, not of despair, but of dawning resolve. He had fallen, yes, but he was not broken. This bitter taste of failure, this humiliation, would not define him. It would forge him. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep, shuddering breath of the cold morning air. He would learn. He would adapt. He would become as cunning as the mountain fox, as patient as the desert viper. He would retreat, not in surrender, but to regroup, to rethink, to rebuild. He would withdraw from these walls, concede this single battle, but not the war. He would let the rebels believe they had won, let them grow complacent in their perceived victory. And then, when they least expected it, he would return. Not with the roar of an impulsive lion, but with the silent, deadly precision of a seasoned hunter. He turned, his gaze now firm, the weariness replaced by a steel-hard resolve. The lion had been wounded, yes, but it was far from dead. It had merely retreated into the shadow, to sharpen its claws and hone its instincts. The next time it emerged, its roar would shake Al-Andalus to its very foundations, and nothing would stand in its way. He would not just conquer his enemies, he would conquer himself. This defeat was not an end, it was the crucible of his reign.